We had, just to say to colleagues, we've had about 188 and counting registrations, but I'm sure people are not here to listen to me, but to Prof Green, who brings us all together today. So I'm sure the numbers will increase. But let me start, colleagues, and a warm welcome to all of you, colleagues and students who are also joining, and friends. And of course, welcome to the 2023 Academy of Science South Africa Humanities Book Award lecture series. And I will qualify the word series in a minute. Let me introduce myself. I'm going to be your facilitator this afternoon. I'm Vasu Reddy, a member of the Academy of Sciences. I was also a member of I'm still a member of the Humanities Standing Committee of ASSAf, as well as being a member of the adjudication panel for the 2023 ASSAf Book Award. On a normal day, I'm based at the University of the Free State. Prior to that, I was the Dean of the Humanities at the University of Pretoria. And now for my sins, I'm the Deputy Vice Chancellor for Research and Internationalization, but I'm really excited by the intellectual project presented by the Academy today, and delighted as always to be here. So this afternoon's lecture is being presented by the winner of the ASSAf Book Award in the category of Established Researcher. And of course, I will say something a little later about our speaker and the winning book. But let me say something very briefly, turning to call it a pithy review of the Humanities Book Awards. The ASSAf Book Prize, aligned to specifically the Humanities project, is not a new initiative. It's an award for a book that is presented to writers of a scholarly, well-written work of nonfiction, published up to 3 years prior to its nomination. Very important for us is that the book should be noteworthy in its contribution to developing a new understanding of a topic in the humanities. Ideas are quite central to the humanities and all science, as we know. The first award, the ASSAf Book Prize, was awarded in 2017 to a really formidable text awarded to Keith Breckenridge for The Biometric State, The Global Politics of Identification and Surveillance in South Africa, 1850 to the present. The second award went to Charles van Onselen in 2021 for his magnificent book, The Night Trains, Moving Mozambican Miners to and from South Africa, circa 1902 to 1955. The ASSAf Awards for books, particularly, awarded biennially for scholarly publications that make an outstanding, and that I think is an operative word, as well as an exemplary contribution to scholarship in the humanities, the social sciences, or the performing arts. It's interesting for colleagues who are joining this afternoon's lecture that for the 2022 edition, ASSAf received 49 nominations, 31 for the Established Researcher category, and 18 for the Emerging Researcher category. Of course, with the publication dates focused on the texts that were submitted for the award from 2019 to 2021. The Academy awarded the prizes on the 30th of March this year at a ceremony at the Vineyard Hotel in Cape Town for those categories. Interestingly, following the award ceremony, the Humanities Selection Panel the Book Award panel decided to host a series of lectures to provide award recipients with a platform to discuss their journeys, call it the motivations behind their books, as well as perhaps maybe the societal impact of the work, and of course, personal influences. All of these issues conjoin in shaping a text, no doubt. And of course, we see the lecture series to a large extent amplifying the recognition of exceptional scholarly contributions made by the awardees. And the wonderful video that was that preceded this event really gives some indication of the text, and I'll say something about that in a minute before I get there. But let me just start out with some house rules for our colleagues who are joining us. And just to remind you, please keep your camera turned off and your microphone muted unless invited to speak by the facilitator. The participants and attendees should type questions in the chat box, of course, as the lecture proceeds, or raise hands during the question session. And of course, please remember to put down your hand once you're finished. I'll speak a little bit about the Q&A once we're done. Should you experience any difficulties technically during the proceedings in terms of your connection, we'd suggest you do the following. Try to restart or log out and log in again, and make sure your speaker volume is turned up. It may happen, as is the case sometimes, that the Zoom screen is minimized on the taskbar accidentally. So please restore it from the taskbar if that is the case. And of course, the sound and the connection will be certainly as good as the quality of your device and the connectivity. So let me just say something about the winners. Today is Prof Lesley Green's moment, and we're very proud to host that as the Academy. Prof Green is from the University of Cape Town and was awarded the book prize for the established researcher for really a groundbreaking, formidable text titled Rockwater Life, Ecology and Humanities for the Decolonial South Africa. The Emerging Researcher, which is another category, award was jointly awarded to Dr. Kaminga from the University of the Witwatersrand for equally, I believe, a formidable text titled Transgender Refugees and the Imagined South Africa, Bodies Over Borders and Borders Over Bodies, as well as to Dr. Darius Ziwanski, I hope I pronounced that correctly, from the University of Cape Town for equally another formidable text titled Gang Entry and Exit in Cape Town, Getting Beyond the Streets in Africa's Deadliest City. With regard to honorable mentions, and this is important in the established researcher category, we had two candidates who received honorable mentions. Professor Louise Green for her book titled Fragments from the History of Loss, the Nature Industry and the Post-Colony, as well as Professor Tina Steiner for her book titled Convivial Worlds, Writing Relation from Africa. Both Prof Louise Green and Prof Tina Steiner from Stellenbosch University. And in the Emerging Researcher category, Dr. Rick de Villiers from the University of the Free State was a sole shortlisted candidate for his book titled, equally a fascinating text, Eliot and Beckett's Low Modernism, Humility and Humiliation. The task of the adjudication panel was really rigorous and time-consuming, but enjoyable and pleasurable at that, reading formidable texts. I want to acknowledge, as a member of the panel, my colleagues who were part of that adjudication panel. Of course, John Higgins needs no introduction from UCT, who was central to that panel. As well as Prof. Zethu Matabeni from Fort Hare University, Prof. Nhlanhla Mpofu, who is formerly from Rhodes, now at Stellenbosch, Dr. Naomi Nkala from WITS, Professor Sheena O'Connell at UP, Prof. Neil Roos, who chaired the panel from Fort Hare, as well as Prof. Crane Sudeen. And of course, we must acknowledge the wonderful ASSAf staff who've been really central to the behind-the-scenes work that makes everything possible. And I wish to acknowledge Susan Felsman, Director of Scholarly Publishing at ASSAf, as well as Maputi Rametse, Project Officer of the Scholarly Program, and of course, the CEO of ASSAf, Prof. Himla Sideyal. Of course, colleagues, as I've indicated, we're going to have a feast of Humanities Book Award lectures in coming months, and watch the space and the correspondence from ASSAf, and we really encourage you to join us. But let me turn now briefly to this afternoon's speaker. And again, if I may, at a personal level, or congratulate Prof Lesley Green, whose formidable text brings us all together as the winning category in the established researcher prize. Prof Green, as we've seen, and if you don't know, is a professor of anthropology and, of course, the co-founder with Frank Matose of the Environmental Humanities South at the University of Cape Town. She currently serves as its director and also recently was awarded a substantive, and I should actually quantify that, $4.4 million grant by the Science for Africa Foundation to develop a social science of the African Anthropocene in partnership with universities in Ethiopia, Tanzania, Malawi, Mozambique, Zimbabwe, the Human Sciences Research Council, and of course, Leeds University. She was, interestingly, also a Fulbright Scholar at the University of California at Santa Cruz, a Mandela Fellow at Harvard, a Rockefeller Humanities Fellow at the Smithsonian, a Cheney Fellow at the University of Leeds. And of course, importantly, her research focuses on justice-based environmental governance sciences in South Africa, with a particular relationship between knowledge and democracy in the global South. And of course, that features centrally in this formidable text that we're celebrating and we're going to hear in a minute or so. Of course, this text was preceded by her first monograph, Knowing the Day, Knowing the World in 2013, which proposed linking Amerindian knowledge with archaeology by rethinking the dualisms offered by modernist thought, thinking about space and time, nature and society. But today's purpose is about the text, the winning text, Rockwater Life, in which Lesley Green examines a fascinating array of identity markers: inequality, racism, colonialism, and environmental destruction in South Africa. And the text asserts a need for environmental research and governance to transition to help address South Africa's deep history of racial oppression and environmental exploitation. And of course, very importantly, it offers an in-depth engagement of environmental conflict in contemporary South Africa. We tend to minimize these issues as they are overridden by daily topical concerns, and yet how important it is. In this text, Green addresses, very interestingly, a deep history of a range of issues that she will talk about. And I'm really delighted I could go on to talk about it, but perhaps just to say, in terms of the text, the contested history of water access in Cape Town, struggles over fracking in the Karoo, the call for the decolonization of science, which remains an interesting idea and project, land restitution versus the politics of soil, baboon management, interestingly, as we think about Cape Town, and the politics of sewage. Quite an array of important topics. So, as I said, colleagues, you're not here to listen to me. I think we're on target with time. Our speaker, Prof Green, will speak for about 35 minutes, and then, of course, we'll have an opportunity to engage her with a Q&A. So, Prof Green, we're really delighted to have you join us today, and I invite you to deliver your lecture.
Oh, thank you so much, Prof Frady. Lovely to meet you, and met fully. We haven't had a good conversation in person, but lovely to meet you. And first of all, thank you so much to the Academy of Science of South Africa. As I said, at the Vineyard Hotel celebration, I had to sit down when I got the call from Neil Roos to say the book had won. I really, I guess, a bit overwhelmed by the amount of interest and support, and particularly from the Academy of Science. It means a lot, because the discussions are precisely how do we link the humanities and the social sciences with the natural sciences and applied sciences. So thank you all for being here. I want to thank a couple of people in particular. First of all, my colleague, Professor Fiona Ross of Anthropology in Cape Town, who insisted on nominating the book. So thank you very much, Fiona, for that. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here at all. And also congratulations and enormous. I'm really interested in the range of topics of the awardees that have been selected by the Humanities ASSAf team. I think if we look at them, Dr. Kaminga's book, which looks at transgender refugees and borders, and Darius Josewski for a book on gangs in Cape Town. So, there's a history there. Why do we have borders and refugees? Where are the gangs coming from? Then, the work that is in the work of Louise Green's book on theorizing nature, and Tina Steiner's book, Convivial Worlds, Writing Relation from Africa, and Rick de Villiers' work as well, thinking about questions of modernity and issues of humiliation. There's a really fascinating set of issues that are present in these books. So again, thank you to the Academy for bringing together this collection of books. And I find it really interesting to have this set of issues which are so clearly connected. If we look at Southern Africa, issues of refugees, issues of gender, issues of loss and conviviality, versions of nature, modernity. All of these issues are so bound into one another. And I'm really grateful to the Academy for putting together this series, and I'm looking forward to hearing more about the other books. But let me go straight to the PowerPoint and go through the little ritual of trying to get the PowerPoint to do its thing on Zoom. Can you see that? I presume you can. And press that, goodie.
Yes, we do. We do see it.
Fantastic. Right. Okay, so what's interesting is that picture, the cover picture taken by Simon Sifton, who lives in Kalk Bay and has made something of a specialization of photographing water. It's a photograph, not a painting. And I think it's that picture, and my editor, Helen Moffat, thank you so much for your guidance and for putting me in touch with Simon. But that picture is arresting precisely because it's a photograph, not a painting. And the ways in which Simon's work brings us to look at Cape water differently by his capacity to capture movement seem to sum up what I was trying to think about in the book, which is a book that thinks about flows and movement over time rather than static, fixed objects. So there are three parts of the book: past, present, futures, and futures imperfect. The very categories, well, the titles of the parts try to suggest that the past, present, and future are always entangled in one another. And what I tried to do is sit with my discomfort with the ways in which environmental governance was being done. I mean, when I started working on this in 2012 on a sabbatical, issues of water and the management of Table Mountain were pressing. Fracking had come to be on the agenda by 2014. We were thinking about that at the University of Cape Town. Then there was the forest debates at the same time as a team of our colleagues were doing the ABC project, which was anthropology, botany, and chemistry, with my colleagues David Gammon of chemistry and Tim Hoffman of botany. And trying to think about indigenous plant medicine in relation to the questions being put on the table by Science Must Fall.
Sorry,
the second part of the book is present futures. What was emerging, what was being challenging. So chapter 4, I was really fascinated by Black environmentalism, emerging Black environmentalisms in Golobeni, in the Philippi horticultural area, and the fact that those were focusing on soil and food, and yet were not really being recognized formally by environmental sciences as environmental struggles. There wasn't really a connection being made between those struggles and the kinds of struggles of Extinction Rebellion at that time, or any of the major predominantly white conservation movements. And then working towards, in the third part, what I wanted to do is grapple with what I was seeing around baboon management, and the question of what a baboon is, when the metaphors that were being used around baboon management were of baboons as criminals. There's even a kind of a list of baboon crimes that monitors would assess, tick off, if a certain baboon is guilty of breaking and entering a vehicle or breaking and entering an occupied vehicle. There were different crimes. And the question arose of what kind of baboon management do we want? Is the only possible relationship with baboons a warlike relationship, or are different relationships possible? And then questions around fisheries management, and so on. So what I was seeing, having kind of kept an eye on environmentalism in South Africa for a couple of years by that point, was I was seeing a number of intense struggles. Struggles over baboon management, struggles over water, struggles over fracking. And typically, these were being presented in highly polemic ways, where there was very often a tremendous tension between academic environmentalism, or scientific advice in governance, and activists on the ground. And I was fascinated by the fact that I was seeing the same patterns over and over and over again, whether in fisheries or baboon management or fracking, and often what was being presented as the better form of, the preferred version of environmentalism was not something that I felt I could really get behind. I mean, for example, the frack-free Karoo campaign, it had, much as I wanted to back the movement, it left me feeling very uncomfortable, because there was an erasure of koi and sand presence in the Karoo, which got its very name from a koi word. So what kind of environmentalism could I get behind? This is where I was going. And one of the things, let me just move this out the way. One of the things that struck me was, at my local BP garage, when I was filling up with petrol one day, saw this Mercedes-Benz in front of me with this little sticker on it, "Save the Rhino and Hunt a Poacher." This is in Newlands, just below UCT, in Western Cape. And it astonished me to see that, because here we were in the Western Cape, where precisely the same argument had been used to exterminate, and I use that word deliberately, the sand, hunt the poacher. And when I went to look at Palala Rhino Sanctuary online, I found that they themselves were, in fact, a hunting lodge, where you could pay a different price, always in several thousands of dollars, to hunt a specific animal. Not rhinos, but you could hunt lions, you could hunt, it was a hunting lodge. So where did that kind of sentiment come from? From people who I would expect to be neighbors, perhaps, and be able to be in dialogue with. And that too was not an environmentalism that I felt was viable, was politically sustainable. So questions around what does a just environmental governance look like began to arise for me, and what kind of environmentalism was there that I could stand behind. Now, my country, there we go. At the same time, I was looking into my own history. This, some of you might recognize as a pencil sketch by Thomas Baines of Makanda or Grahamstown, where there was this huge elephant and ivory poaching going on. And as I was researching my own family history, just out of curiosity, found that 4 of my own great uncles in the 1830s or 1840s had purchased an elephant gun, and there was a record of the 4 of them shooting 100 elephants in one day at the mouth of the Fish River. And that's really struck me, because my question to myself was, well, what does that mean for me to be an environmentalist? If, how can I oppose poaching, for example, when I myself have survived, or my family history, my ancestry has survived precisely because of this. And I was further horrified to find that one of my one of that extended family had sailed off to England with a huge load of ivory to sell, and bought a printing press and brought that back to Grahamstown. And I didn't put this in the book because I couldn't find the backup for that. But what I understand from colleagues in literature is that during the Sixth Frontier War in the 1830s, there was a printing press that had actually been melted down to make bullets to protect the frontier farms. So, as a settler, colonial South Africa with 1820 settlers on both sides of my lineage, what does it mean to be an environmentalist, where our family own presence here was based in profound and devastating environmental destruction of the scale that is captured in this portrait. And then, of course, at the same time, there's this very, very interesting form of environmentalism emerging with the Philippi Horticultural Area Campaign here in Cape Town to preserve farmland. And that's one of their posters from Nazir Sonde, "Resistance is Fertile," which is, I think, a delicious phrase. Okay, so each of the chapters, I wanted to, rather than have an overview of every chapter, I thought that would be most useful in this discussion to share a particular image from each section that I found that arrested me, that made me hesitate in my desire, in my thinking around what form of environmentalism I could get behind. And this was one of them. This was from the 1720s. It's in fact a German picture that was attached to a map in a book that was published by Peter Colby in, I think, 1725. Colby was German. The book was published in German and Latin, and then translated into Dutch, French, and English. And at the time that I was researching the history of Cape Town and water, I was very interested to find an article by 2 colleagues in library studies, one in France, one in South Africa, who said that they'd gone through all the maps and they couldn't, all the archives that they could find, and there was no record that they could find of a map of where the Khoi had settled in, or were present in Cape Town. And so, there was this dilemma: where had those settlements been? And here was this picture on top of a map. So it was this picture at the top of the page, and underneath it was a map of the Cape. And there on the right, under what you can see is now today's Tambour's Kloof, there are very clearly the circle of huts that were associated with the Khoi settlements. And there it was. To my astonishment, when I went to have a look at the translations of the German and Latin text into English, French, and Dutch, which of course English, French, and Dutch being the colonial powers that struggled over the Cape, this picture had been separated from the map and redrawn. So it was completely separate from the map. It was just an image accompanying the book, but separated from the map, which was the sort of evidentiary that the book was presenting. And to see the actual presence of the Khoi on Table Mountain, on Lion's Head, on the Lion's Rump, was something that to this day shifts how I feel and how I respond to that landscape when I drive around what's on the left, Devil's Peak from UCT into the City Bowl. To be so aware that there was such an extraordinary presence and settlement that was not there. So again, this uncertainty and unease. This was another image that really caused me enormous unease with the ontologies that I had inherited as a scholar. And this one is a wax seal from an envelope, and it's from the Officer of Slaves and Deeds in Cape Town. And that officer, that is the seal of the Deeds Office. That was from about 1828, when this was considered a progressive move, because the Deeds Office, which is the same Deeds Office that registers property ownership in Cape Town, had begun to register slaves as well. This was considered progressive by the British, because up to that point, the enslaved had no political presence, there was no record of their presence, and therefore there was no capacity for them to legally take on mistreatment, egregious mistreatment. But the fact that slaves, the enslaved, were considered property in the same way that one relates to land really puzzled me. It obviously said something egregious about the practice of slavery, but it also raises questions about how do we see property if mastery and ownership are ways of thinking about people that we're not prepared to accept. Why are we not thinking about property and ownership as problems in relation to land, given that land is always moving? The air moves, the rain moves, the aquifers move, the wind blows, the land is a commons. So these were significant questions for me. In the second part, present futures, that was being written during the Science Must Fall era, and I was initially quite taken aback by the Science Must Fall presentation, which I'm sure many of you have seen or remember at that time. But then the more that I read the speech and transcribed the speech and thought about this call for science to fall, and particularly the descriptions of Isaac Newton, again, I had to hesitate with the opprobrium that was being heaped upon the students who had spoken, because it seemed to me that there was a history of the work of Isaac Newton, who was central to the questioning that was raised at the time. Why is Isaac Newton venerated so, was the broad question that was being raised. Apple falls on his head and now he's considered the father of science. What about other knowledges? And when I started to study the work of Newton more closely in the archives of Newton, I realized that Newton himself was very deeply into alchemy and some quite unusual forms of knowledge that definitely wouldn't be considered science by any stretch, but he was open and willing to think these things through. But on his death, his papers were separated into two sets. The scientific and mathematical set went to one set of people, and the alchemical and more magical texts went elsewhere. So I thought, well, I think that in fact Isaac Newton and many of these scholars, students that were asking questions about the history of science, I think they would actually have a very interesting conversation, because I think Newton would have some interesting things to say about perhaps about the ways in which his laws of science have been taken up as framings of rationality that are unquestionable and that give a political power to science as the only way to think about relationships in the world. That then opened up a space to start to think about Black environmentalisms and the understanding of relations in landscapes, where I think some of the legacy of Black environmentalism that has been destroyed in so many parts of Africa by settler colonialism and the kinds of rationalities that have been imposed upon the landscape, the challenge was to think through what might this phrase sons and daughters of soil, which is such an honorific, what might that fragment suggest about the legacies of Black environmentalism in South Africa? Is that perhaps a way to start to think about what Black environmentalism might look like, or does look like? And certainly when I was looking at at Xolobeni or at the Philippi Horticultural Area campaign, what was evident was that a very, very strong Black environmentalism linked to land. So once again, we come back to land and property, and the question around if Black South Africans have had over 100 years of separation from the land, where the 1913 Land Act has never been addressed, and if we actually understand that the Bantustans began to take form at the same time as the nature conservation spaces, like Kruger was formed in 1910, the 1913 Land Act was 1913, of course, but these two, in a sense, the Bantustan and the Naturestan, if we may push words a little bit, took form at the same time. And that said something very interesting, because that indexed the history of racism, where Blackness was exiled from increasingly white-dominated society. But nature spaces were also being exiled, as this predominant idea of civilization took hold, which enabled the destruction of landscapes through increasingly industrial farming, through urban landscapes. And that also meant that because there were spaces of nature out there, a way of relating to the world, a way of governing the world becomes possible, where one does not have to take responsibility for the breaking of metabolic relations and other forms of relation in Earth. So increasingly one becomes a citizen not of Earth, but a citizen of a state, which is an economic and often nationalist framework. So again, the questions came, we have to find a different way to think. Third part really starts with, it starts with baboons, but I was struck, you'll see the Cape Times billboard from 2014, Army gets stuck into pearly poachers. This was an astonishing thing to me, given the extent to which there are lobster walkouts, which have to do with climate warming, possibly also with pollution, since lobsters are highly sensitive to scent in water. There you see the Cape sewage going out to sea at Greenpoint, equivalent of 40 Olympic-sized swimming pools of raw sewage being pumped out to sea a day from 4 points around the Cape. As if that would just disperse, as if the ocean is a place called nowhere, as if we can just simply extract and excrete and dump out into the world, and there's no responsibility taken for the metabolic processes. My colleague Joe Barnes always says the idea is that the solution to pollution is dilution. And yet one is seeing very, very high levels of contaminants in sediments and in sessile organisms along the coast. And at the same time, our colleagues in marine biology, and I'm wonderfully glad to see George Branch is on this call. Hello, George, and great respect to you and your team for the work you've done on ecological regime shift with lobsters moving across from Cape Point across False Bay, adult lobsters, in the late 1990s, early 2000s, and changing the ecology of the kelp forests, precisely because when the lobsters move, they eat the sea urchins. and the sea urchins are no longer there to be the nursery school teachers, if you like, the creches of the baby perlemoen. So lobsters move, sea urchins get eaten up, and then there's no nurseries for the perlemoen to grow. So there's a huge set of ecological issues going on around the crash of perlemoen populations. And yet the army gets called up to defend a snail against the citizens. There's something surreal and astonishing about that. So, as I was doing this work, I began to become more and more interested too in the work of post-colonial early thinkers like Aimé Césaire, who works with the surreal in order to surface what we are otherwise unable to see. Because if we're learning to see relations in terms of what we expect, we become blind to the complexities and the disconcertments that are out there. And one of those was baboons. Seeing baboons being managed when I was cycling around the Cape, around Cape Point and coming down into Scarborough, seeing the baboons being managed in a quasi-military style, in ways that took me back to what it was like to be a student, and you'd have the riot police, going after and chasing and trying to keep the baboons out of town without paying any attention to what people were doing, which was not managing their waste properly. Again, so learning to be open to disconcertments was a key thing. So those are these 6 studies trying to work with fracking, with baboons, with land, with oceans, with water, and the science must fall debate. Each of those were situations that disconcerted me, and I felt that to understand them, I had to really dig deep. And the more I dug, as rabbit holes are always wonderful things. The more I dug deep, the more interesting stuff there was to find. And so, it became a case of every single library at UCT, the medical library, the law library, the science library, the humanities library, everything became interesting, because the challenge was, how do you hold the big picture together? We live in, those of us who are academics or students, we live in scholarly worlds where our worlds are separate, like these images on the screen. They're separate disciplines. Zoology separate from botany, separate from contaminant studies, etc., etc. But when you're on a bicycle on a road, or when you're living in the real world, they are integrated. And what I wasn't seeing in the scholarly world that I inhabited was a credible, peer-reviewable way of doing that integrative work. The peer review was happening in disciplinary spaces, and often it was very difficult to get a paper published in a journal if it was interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary, because a disciplinary focused peer reviewer would say, no, you can't publish this, or you've got to split it into different papers. So, transdisciplinary work is difficult. What I was seeing is that the people that were claiming to have the big picture were very often the consultants who were advising environmental governance, and particularly the what is often called the shadow state globally, the big companies that advise on science and on environmental governance. The big, these big teams that start to advise on environmental governance, we're not really paying attention to how do we integrate. And the assumptions that were being made about what integrates were profoundly problematic, because what was being offered as the great integrator was money, finance, economy. So, we'd inherited a way of thinking about the world separated into nature and society. And we had challenged that division of nature and society in respect of race and racism and sex and sexism. But we hadn't brought that critique to bear on how we relate to the world. And that, if you are trained as an anthropologist and you've ever read any Levi-Strauss is very clear in any mythical system where you've got a binary system, the hero is that which links, the person that links, or the figure that links the two opposites is the hero. And somehow under neoliberal governance, we find ourselves in a space where economics and big finance is seen as the hero that is going to bring it all together. So hence the big companies like Bain and McKinsey and others who are advising on how to financialize, for example, carbon. The carbon market is a big part of many of these big accounting firms now. So, and again, that was not a version of environmentalism that I wanted to get behind. So in each of these cases, what I wanted to do was dig deep, 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 until I got to a place where I felt that I could see something different, where I wasn't seeing what was already being presented to me as the real, the true, and the obvious. Right. So learning from the 6 studies was, first of all, the absence of history and of land dispositions from environmentalism is absolutely critical to address at universities on this entire continent. To ask for a Black environmentalism without paying attention to land struggles and the trauma of land dispositions is to ask the impossible. And certainly in Environmental Humanities South, where it's been a joy to teach with Frank Matose and Nikiwe Solomon and others over the last couple of years, more and more people have begun to realize that there's a profound challenge for us as teachers to create spaces where, when we invite students to start to connect with the earth as an earth citizen, we also have to allow and find ways, we haven't figured it all out yet, but find ways to support students who then have to confront 4 or 5 generations of separation from land, never went to rivers or beaches or farms as children. And one of the students that I spoke to described it as discovering a parent that you never knew you had. So there's a lot more to be said about that. There's a paper in progress on that. But to work towards an inclusive environmentalism, we have to begin with land. And if I can just to give an example from the Cape Flats here, the Cape where I'm sitting at the moment, the Cape Flats was subject to a brutal erasure of its sand dunes in 1969 in preparation for the expulsion of colored South Africans from the apartheid's declared white areas. So the first thing that happens is, the sand dunes of the Cape Flats get allocated to a cement company, a Portland Cement Company, and the Consol Glass Company to extract the silica sands and the limestone sands to make cement and glass. So there's this extraordinary erasure or removal of extraction of these sand dunes, which is still ongoing in Makassar, preparatory to the dumping of people on the Cape Flats. And I wish that my colleagues in conservation could see that their desperate and critically important struggles to prevent extinction of certain plant species and animal species that are only found here in the Cape, I wish that they could understand that their enemy is not people, but that the erasure of Cape Flats nature has everything to do and everything in common with the struggle of the homeless who encroach on lands that are allocated to nature, and that the solution is not more fences and walls and guns and fees for access. The solution is building relationships with nature, that there's different ways to do this. And so that questions around the militarization of environmentalism became more and more interesting, and that's something that Frank Matose is developing in some books that are coming out, one of which is already out, which is an edited collection on militarized conservation. Okay, next point, just to try and keep things moving, the social ecological systems seem to me to need an overhaul as a concept, precisely because while it's possible to talk about ecological systems, it's not possible to talk about a social system in the same way. Social systems are simply not a prominent analytic in social science and humanities scholarship. Even if we take a very, very hierarchical system like a university, for example, you get even the most senior figures in conflict and in trouble because processes are not followed. So social systems are not things that you can just model and let them flow. In fact, by contrast to the idea of systems, which is a machine metaphor, one of the best books, in my opinion, on social science method is simply called Mess in Social Science Research by John Law from Open University in the UK. Thirdly, Aimé Césaire had this extraordinary phrase, colonization is thingification. And the post-colonial environmentalists, or post-colonial thinkers, I beg your pardon, from the 1930s, 1940s, such among them Césaire, were railing against the version of the world that was being presented in colonial scholarship in France and elsewhere in Europe. And one of the major interventions that movement, which is I think the center of its thinking at the moment, is one of the centers of its thinking is in the Caribbean through the work of Edouard Glissant. The focus is on a relational environmentalism as opposed to an object-based environment. In other words, an environmentalism that focuses on relations rather than taxonomies and objects. Lots more to be said on that. But fourthly, Homo economicus, is the phrase that Foucault, I think, used first to try to characterize the ways in which neoliberal philosophy theorizes the human. The human is primarily an economic actor in that theory, and hence you get game theory and behavioral economics and so on. What about if we started to think instead of the material relations that we are all involved in every single day, as we eat, as we excrete, as we plant and harvest, as we throw away things? What about Homo sedimenta? I think there's ways of thinking about human presence on the earth, in the earth, as part of daily sediment making that are more useful, that we can begin to work with. And so to start to try to theorize this, which is what I tried to offer in the concluding chapter of the book, is we need to be thinking not so in terms of trying to build an earthly politics, and I mean that quite seriously, as a frame for a politics that we can work with, that we can graduate students from our universities who are keenly attuned to what it means to be an earth citizen, a partner with earth processes and relations, rather than a master of those processes and relations with the destructive consequences that we are familiar with. What that involves requires looking at material flows, understanding movement as central to our ecological and environmental governance. For example, when the wind blows from the southeast, as it so often does in Cape Town, it affects both Marina de Gama and Vrygrond, Shack Settlement, and Lavender Hill alike. When the wind blows over that great big waste dump in January when everything's dry, that dust from our waste goes over all flows, aquifers, wind, pollution. They know no earthly boundaries, and so much of our governance, environmental governance, is fixated on boundaries, and we see this particularly in law, where law pays attention to particular kinds of space. In the law of the coast, I think there's 3 sets of law for ocean law at a certain distance, ocean law closer, then there's the littoral zone, and then there's the internal zone. You've got these ways of thinking about environmental governance that have very, very little to do with earth processes and a whole lot more to do with property, theories of property. To do that, and I think this also takes us into questions around what does sustainability mean. And going back to the waste dump here in Capricorn, again, there's a form of environmentalism that I really don't want to be part of. And while on the one hand I celebrate the city of Cape Town's methane harvesting from the waste dump, that's terrific. Methane harvesting, methane is a major greenhouse gas, but there's flaring going on of those gases, and what comes out of the waste dump is anything but pure methane. And to flare that gas at a low level, close to thousands and thousands of people at Vrygrond, at Capricorn, at Business Park, at Lavender Hill, Zeekoevlei, to flare those gases right there it makes the place uninhabitable, puts people at risk when the wind blows in certain ways. So we need to I don't really want to be part of a sustainability that allows people to allows polluters elsewhere to claim carbon credits while creating inhabitability or uninhabitability in a certain at the local level. So that is at the beginnings of an attempt to try to rethink what does the social science of earth governance look like at the local level. To do that, there's a lot of rethinking that we need to be doing, rethinking the inherited modernist dualisms that came from Europe in the 1600s and 1700s. I won't go into the detail of that history, but we have inherited a knowledge structure that bifurcates self from knowledge, nature from society, space from time, as if there's no movement. It's not a tenable division if you're looking at physics, for example. And I think many of these ideas that we've inherited have really passed their sell-by date, and yet we still teach them in university. They're still hardwired in the very architecture of our universities. So there's a rethinking that needs to happen around how we think, how we carve up our disciplines, how we and to bring that into dialogue with the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, which are critically important and they're a major leverage tool that can and should be used. But we are coming up to 2030. It was Agenda 2030 was the due date for the Sustainable Development Goals to be achieved, and we need to starting to think about what comes after 2030. And I think working towards habitability at the local level is key, because current approaches to environmental sustainability that prioritize and place preference on economics don't always make sustainability projects locally sustainable. And I think environmental sustainability that's not politically sustainable is not environmentally sustainable. So it has to be a rethinking of justice issues together with environmental sustainability. We have some extraordinary resources in African environmentalism that make a lot of sense, and I find it fascinating to think of those interventions from people like Amilcar Cabral, the agronomist and revolutionary in West Africa, Wangari Maathai, who I'm sure many of you know as a Nobel Prize winner for her work on the Greenbelt movement in Kenya, Cesare's extraordinary poetry, epic poems that link colonially damaged landscapes with colonially damaged bodies. These are some of the resources. It seems to me that the post-colonial and decolonial thinkers have grappled with relationality in ways that provide the intellectual leadership that we need to get out of the conundrum we find ourselves in with an approach informed by 16th century modernism that is no longer helpful. And these dissenting thinkers like Cabral, Matthias, Cézanne, and others should really lead the way in offering us ways to think about relationships. And I think that this is not and cannot be reduced to some kind of epistemic charity of indigenous knowledge. We must make space for it within our universities, as if it's a moral thing to do. This is not a moral thing to do. This is looking at Wangari Maathai's realization that when you cut the trees, you're going to dry out the soil. And that's exactly, for those of you that have been reading The Guardian of late, the Maui fires that devastated the island of Maui just over a week ago were advanced really by colonial pineapple plantations, which desiccated the soil, in turn desiccated the vegetation and forests, and created the conditions where wildfire could erupt. We've seen the same thing in Knysna here in South Africa. We're seeing the same thing in Canada. It fits with what Wangari Maathai was saying, what Wangari was saying about what she had seen in Kenya. The plantations arrive, the water level goes down. I'm talking about the tea plantations. That fits very, very closely with the very innovative and interesting approach of critical zone thinking, which looks at the critical zone. And I think the critical zone thinking comes from scientists who are thinking at the interstices of biology and geology and working with biogeosciences. And then starting to think about how do you create, how do we understand this thin layer of habitability on the Earth's surface between aquifer and cloud, where those relations are going. So we're starting to think then on the vertical, not just on the horizontal, in terms of property relations.
Prof Green, we just ask, this is fascinating. If you could wrap up, because there's the audience is raving to go to engage.
Thank you. Okay, so this is my last slide. So how do we advance beyond sort of atmosphere, hydrosphere, lithosphere studies? How do we include histories and dispossessions, personhood? What does it mean to feel an Earth citizen? How do we bring infrastructure together with biogea? These are the kinds of processes, and that's where this next big project is going, with a comparative study of 6 sites broadly along the Indian Ocean coast, or at least affected by Indian Ocean weather systems. Thank you very much. I'm done.
No, absolutely. Thank you. I mean, we could go on listening to you. I mean, an elegant presentation. Thank you. Really opening up the text in such elegant ways. I couldn't help but, I mean, I'm so glad that I was exposed to Claude Lévi-Strauss as a student, and you turned to him, and of course the deep structures that inform your lecture, but in a way opening up the text. And of course, for colleagues who've not read the text, this is really elegantly written, theoretically astute, and empirically fresh in so many ways. So, what you present to us is really, I love the question or the comment you made, in your presentation about how do you hold the bigger picture together, in a way is a kind of a central element to the narrative in your text as well. This is not just simply an anthropology, but it's an anthropology of science in many ways, and elegant strands come together in the transdisciplinary way. In fact, you do transdisciplinarity. You practice it in the writing and the way you speak about this, and even moving beyond the structuralist paradigms, which are very important, but reading into the deeper structures, around the personal, the political, very important, the scientific, the activist, the historical, the contemporary. I mean, we know what happens in structuralist power and thought and the binaries, and you kind of untangle that. Voice and silence, very, very important. Presence and absence, visibility and erasure, capital versus people, very, very important coming through. I love the creation there of vocabulary and language around the nature stand versus the Bantustan. That's quite formidable. In fact, it's a fascinating idea. Not only the politics of science, but the history of science in so many ways, and so on and so forth, that you bring to us, and in many ways that open up our thinking. And I really want to encourage colleagues to think about this text, but read it in many ways. I'm going to open up, Prof Lesley Green. Thank you for the generosity of ideas that you've shared, and take a few questions. And again, I just want to remind colleagues, we have some time. I am aware of the program. We'll take about 25 minutes of questions. We'll take it in some clusters, but I would like to advise you to please put on your microphone and your camera. But if you want to make a comment, please keep it brief. If you have a question, equally, please keep it brief, and we'll take it in clusters of 3. So let's see what hands go up. And Maputi and Susan, if you don't mind, just alert me should I not see the hands, but I'll have it on my participant list so I can see what's there. There were some lovely comments coming through. You have in your midst Prof Lesley Green, a student who graduated at Bohering, who really praised the work that you have done with her. And groundbreaking work together with Frank Matose. There is a question here. I don't see any hands, but Maputi, please remind me, because it's difficult navigating a screen and looking at all the participants. There's a question here from George Berger, like John Berger. Prof Green, do you see any path for a productive dialogue between your personalized, poetic activist and morally selective view of history, rather interesting choice, even though you challenge that, and human conflict and the empirical, dispassionate, systems-oriented approach of scientists? There's a question mark. And related to that, how do you see your work in relation to Nigel Bigar's recent book, Colonialism, A Moral Reckoning? Because I see little scope for common ground unless one can have an adversarial, collaborative relationship. If you register that question, then we'll see if there's any others. There's a comment here. Congratulations, sets the land, unintended, for what environmental social sciences can and should aim. Okay, I unfortunately don't see any other hands up, but I'm going to check on this screen to see if there's any. Oh yes, Anna, maybe you want to reformulate your question. Please go ahead, if you can unmute.
Thank you very much. A real pleasure to be here. Thank you, Lesley, for, as ever, the most inspiring talk that I have seen this year. I'm Anna Krzyboszyńska, Associate Professor from Finland, University of Oulu. And I actually would really like to give more air to George Mike Berger's question, as I think this is also where a lot of your energies are going now, Professor Green. You have been hardened by these adversarial politics with sciences in the service of certain interests. And I think you have become impatient, very rightly, with social scientists speaking to other social scientists. And so all humanities scholars talking to other humanities scholars about how we're all in trouble. And therefore you're pouring a lot of your energy right now into curricula and into working with students. And we could already hear echoes of this in your talk. So I would very much like you to actually engage with the previous question and to tell us a little bit more how you are seeking to make inroads from theory into action. And because I think this is something that we need to hear. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks. Thanks so much there. Jane, let's take your question. I think Anna was building on the previous comment in the chat box. Jane, if you could.
Yes, cool. Thank you so much. Yes, I echo all of this about how amazing this talk is. Thank you so much, Lesley. So I'm just interested in picking up and wondering if you've gone there, because I haven't read your book yet. The notion of kind of relationality as participation. So this is kind of how I'm working with it, as in the alternative, the other end of the continuum of alienation. Just because I think there's something there that helps us to think about the nature of relationality between people themselves, each other, and Earth, right? And it's the alienation that brings together the ability almost of the exploitation and extractivism, whether it's of people or of planet or whatever. So I'm just kind of interested to put that there and see if it has any kind of traction with your thinking about relationality. Thanks.
Thanks, Jane. Thank you very much. And then perhaps a third, because I think, Lesley, the previous question by Anna was kind of building on the first. I have just a question because I don't see any other hands up. You know, the outset of your talk, you talked about the, you know, the shaping of the stakes, the intense struggles and the competing interests. And I'm kind of interested, you know, post the writing of the text, you know, are there any synergies or perhaps divergences or any new ideas that come together about these intense struggles, competing interests that you've had to perhaps rethink? That's the question. Are there comments from colleagues who are open to making any observations while Lesley rejoins us? Just raise your hand. Any other voices? That's a pity. I don't see any questions also. No, it's not load shedding. Gosh, what could that be? Okay, Anna, please go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, in the absence of Professor Green, perhaps you, Professor Reddy, as the host of this event, could reflect a little bit on the reception that you are seeing of Professor Green's book, and the sort of the possibilities that you see for the kind of environmental politics that she's advocating.
Yeah, you put me on the spot. That's a tad difficult. You know, all I can say, you know, it's well, I mean, I think the reception of the book is outstanding. It's receiving really beyond praise, I think, deep engagement and debate around issues. And of course, as you heard, her, you know, unpacking the text, if I could use that phrase, in a way, you know, moving beyond the life of the text in its creation, you know, going back in time, really also reflecting deeply on issues that are actually quite current, relevant, and to a large extent deeply political, social, and indeed human. And in fact, this is a text that I think, in my opinion, frankly, I mean, when as part of the adjudication panel, I'm not the only one, but John, perhaps also feel free to come in here. I think there was a deep consensus about this text in terms of its ideas, but also that the text is moving beyond you know, the time zone in which it was created, because as you've heard, you know, the text is created with archive, history, experience, influence, and activism, and in a way kind of deeply resonates almost as a text that kind of, you know, straddles time, space and time. We've heard that as well. I don't know, John, if you want to come in, unless of course you know, Lesley has rejoined us, and she has, Lesley. You've got those questions, so please go ahead, Lesley, and welcome back. You just need to unmute.
Thank you. Sorry, a little bit of a power snafu there.
Okay, well, we're delighted that you're back.
Anyway, perhaps you could.
You got the 3 questions, did you?
I got the one question, which was
Oh, Lord.
Prof Berger.
Okay, and then terribly sorry, I'm going to have to repeat that. Anna, if you could just abbreviate that, and then Jane to you. Thank you. Anna?
Thank you very much. Well, Lesley, I was singing your praises, but beyond that, I would really like to hear a little bit more about how this person, you, hardened by these conflicts with natural sciences in the service of certain interests, how you are turning to education and to curricula and to students, and therefore, what is your message for social science that seeks to do more than just speak to other social scientists about these extremely urgent issues that you identify? Thank you.
Thanks, Anna. And Jane, if you could just abbreviate that and quite clear.
I will try. Thanks. Yeah, we were also just loving what you've been talking about. And for me, it raised the thing like this focus on relationality, which I love. And just thinking about it on the continuum of sort of between participation to alienation, as it were, so that we're kind of looking for these means of participation versus the alienation from ourselves, each other, and the earth that enables the kind of extractivism, exploitation, same kind of, that dynamic. So just thinking about that. Thanks.
Yeah.
Great. Go ahead, Lesley. I'll remove my question.
Thank you so much, Basu. I think I've been working with my colleague Steve Banwart from the School of Earth and Environment at Leeds University on a paper that he was his idea, but he invited me to work with him on it. We have this idea of the great extinction, and his thinking as an engineer and a critical zone scientist is how do we think about the great alienation as part of the same problem that we're dealing with the great extinction, the great alienation. And I find that such a powerful way of thinking about the work we need to do to refigure what it is to be human in and of the planet. And the challenge, for example, of consumers, we're all consumers, we're all sitting talking to one another through rocks. The minerals that have been extracted from rocks. We are talking through rocks to one another. These are the, how do we rethink consumerism as one of the great drivers of extinction and of planetary crisis? There's a lot of work to do to rethink that, but I think when the natural sciences posit the figure of the human as the enemy, there's all sorts of politics become permissible, which includes making it a little bit easier for science to stand behind the guns of the state, to impose environmental governance solutions through policing, through fines. Now, of course, policing and fines and guns may be necessary in certain instances. There's not an either or here. But does that have to be the first principle, the first way of governing, that we must have policies with legal responses, the kind of crimes and fines approach to environmental governance? Where, in fisheries governance in South Africa, that was a spectacular failure. We had students at the time who wrote dissertations working with fishing communities around the West Coast. There was a team of, I think, 10 students doing master's and PhD dissertations. And some extraordinary and brilliant work came through that project a decade ago. And one of our students, Oliver Schmidt, said that people take it as a point of pride to disobey regulations that they believe to be unjust. So hold that in mind. And then hold in mind the mom that I met at a children's chess club event one day, who's a natural scientist, who said to me, there is no alternative. People have to be forced. This is a scientist. People have to be forced. That takes us down the road of an eco-fascism. It takes us down the road of a way of thinking about environmental governance that's profoundly at odds with environmental sustainability itself, precisely because it's politically unsustainable. Frank and I are co-supervising a very wonderful student in the Congo, Guy Kamela, who is looking at the ways in which REDD+, one of the pillars of our planetary emergency approaches, the ways in which REDD+ is being rolled out in the forest. So Guy himself is a highly regarded environmental consultant from Cameroon who worked on REDD+, advancing REDD+ in Cameroon for many years, and then came to us to say he wanted to write a dissertation on its benefits. But as he's gone into the field site, he's been horrified by the amount of violence that comes into play when a northern polluter buys a credit in order to continue to pollute, not change at all. And that money gets used to hire a small local militia to stop people from using their forest. And that is presented as sustainability because we are reducing forest degradation. It doesn't work, you know. It's not a sustainable way to work towards environmental governance. And I think next week in Nairobi, there's going to be the African Climate Summit. And I think these kinds of issues, it's going to be interesting to see how these kinds of issues are being raised, because there's tremendous pushback against this approach that presumes that scientific advice is best situated behind the guns of the state. And I think it's time for us to start to think about how do we build a people's science that works with what people are interested in, with what matters to people, and not only pay attention to the key debates that are emerging in our professional societies of our respective disciplines. Back to you.
Thank you. You've covered all those questions, I think, in a response, Lesley. Thank you. Thank you so much.
If I may have my hand, just on one point in what you said, I think there's a gulf, a massive gulf, between the way you're thinking about what you're calling you call it a science. I'm not quite sure because I don't recognize it as a science. But the one thing that you ended your comments on was to say that scientists want to implement environmentalism behind the guns of the state. Now, I think that's not really an opening an avenue for now discussion about different approaches to what is reality and how one should approach reality and how one can make it work for human beings. That's a political statement. That's a challenge where you put your adversary in a position of moral inferiority. I don't think it's true. I don't think that's the way you are going to find scientists open their minds to the way that you're perceiving the world. And it's simply not a way that we're going to resolve the problems of humanity if you put your adversaries in morally inferior positions like that. I regarded the material that you present, your feelings about that material as absolutely sincere and a genuine attempt to get to grips with the issues that face mankind at this stage in our history. I take that as granted. But there must be an equal response in the opposite direction if there's to be any communication between the two camps.
Thanks, George. Sorry, Lesley. Lesley, I'll just take one final question, and then you could respond there. Kelly Gillespie, and then that will be the final question, and then I'm going to, following you, hand over John. Kelly?
Hi, thank you. Thank you, Lesley, for a wonderful book and a wonderful overview today. I suppose my question does follow on Mike's, because I see his almost kind of relegation of your work to what he calls personalized, poetic activist and morally selective view of history. And I take that as an example of the kind of Eurocentric rationality that science, that you're trying to push against in science. So I think it's very helpful for us to hear a response and to see the interaction and to figure out how do we move beyond that, right? Because here we have an example of that, exactly what you're referring to. And I suppose the thing that I go to is that my work on policing and the rise of the police state and the kind of history of the police state came into conversation with your work on environmentalisms precisely when that moment of what you call ecofascism arises, right? When the police get called in order to protect the nature stand or in order to secure land in a particular kind of way that mimics and replicates that settler paradigm and brings in the deep history of colonial and apartheid securitization to bear on those politics. So I guess partly what I'm so curious about is there's this, it feels like the day of that settler colonial relationship to land is, we see its failures everywhere. We see its failures. It's so clear that it's failed as a political project, as an environmental project. And there's this really interesting rise of indigenous ways of knowing and turn to indigenous ways of knowing and being in relationship to land and land governance and land management. But that kind of relationality that is so obvious to that way of being, and so that shows up that settler way of being as so stupid. It does also require in that relationality a fundamental giving up of power. And I think that's at the heart of the problem, is that it's not necessarily a matter of convincing. It's a matter of fundamentally shifting the relations of power in this place. And that's why you see the police emerging so forcefully and frontally when that power is challenged. So, I in some ways, I agree with Mike. It's like, this is not necessarily a matter of convincing the white masculinist science project of Eurocentric science. It's a matter of really going to shift the conditions of power as they're operating in a place like ours. So yeah, that's a comment about how do we deal with that as a problem.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Kelly. I must apologize. I'm going back on my word. There's one final question that I've got to take. And because we had a slight break there, I hope I'll be forgiven by the ASSAf colleagues. Masikole Nkumbesi, if you could raise your question, and then Lesley, if you wouldn't mind, and then I'll Masikole.
Thank you very much, Program Director. To Professor, I have not had the opportunity to actually read the book, but it's quite interesting how it sows between the different eras up to where we are today. And there are many moral lessons learned along the way. And to then look at the fact that at this very moment, you touched on some injustice that is currently taking place, affecting the residents of Vrygrond in Cape Town. With all this wealth of knowledge and various moral references and perhaps even legal references, why are we still allowing what is happening to still continue? Because the fact that it made its way to this book gives me the impression it follows the same thread as all the other injustices which started from several generations ago, but it's still giving the impression that it's still, some traits of those activities are still taking place to this very day, and affecting communities who are disadvantaged, and we are still observing it, and it's taking the shape of or the currency of carbon credits, but in essence it's the same thread. Is there enough debate taking place, or is it being addressed? Because, for example, I was not even aware of it. I live in Cape Town, but it doesn't necessarily mean that maybe there's not enough noise being made about it. Thank you.
Thank you. And that's the final question. Leslie, over to you, and then I'll hand over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone who's spoken. Masikole, I think one of our students is working on Vrygrond, looking at water contamination. We are hoping to get onto the air pollution. We've been trying to get onto the air pollution for a while. But what's interesting is that there's an extraordinary NGO in Vrygrond called Where Rainbows Meet, started by Maimuna Sheikh about 13, 14 years ago. And among other things, they run a farm, a small farm, to grow food, and they run very, very active and effective soup kitchens. And because they were watering with municipal water, their water bills were very high. And so they approached the Department of Agriculture, who put a borehole in. But nobody tested the water beforehand. And the result of watering with that borehole water is that they're struggling to keep their vegetables alive. And this, we've seen this before in other attempts at vegetable gardening, that switching over to borehole water in this particular area, you start to see the plants dying rather than living. And why is that? Well, the answer comes up in a United Nations Environment Program funded study of the quality of aquifer water. It was published in 2022, I think, by Riemann, where he shows exceedances of over 1,000% of the maximum possible water, contaminants, and and that was just borehole studies of borehole water in the broad area. Now, an exceedance of over 1,000% could be very, very much higher. That simply means that that was the lab's limit. So it's a slow process to start to test that water for the various metals and the various other kinds of persistent organic pollutants to try and isolate what it is. But the simple fact of the matter is that the aquifer is contaminated because the apartheid state built the sewage treatment works at Strandfontein with those huge settlement pans that look like a pizza from the air. They built them on sand. They never lined those pans. So you can imagine, 40% of Cape Town sewage goes to those sewage pans, settles there, and that's very close to the major recharge zone of the Cape Flats aquifer. The result is that we've got a profoundly polluted aquifer, so polluted that if you are watering from that, and it happens to be that the particular water that comes through that day, or in your area, you can be losing that. Now, those are the kinds of things that we need to struggle with. But it's a tremendous challenge to try to get the powers that be to listen to the science. On the contrary, what we've had in many, many instances is city officials writing back to journals, requesting that articles be retracted. And then one has to argue that. There's reputational harm that comes about. There's extraordinary science that's being done on that water contamination. But the city officials responsible for listening to that are simply not listening, and rather engaging in attacking the scientists that are involved. And engaging with political marketing companies to provide the spin, much the same way as the tobacco industry did, to try and say that cigarettes don't cause any harm. So, it's not only knowledge is power, but also ignorance is power. And one is up against a very significant industry of advancing ignorance and advancing confusion and sowing doubt about the value of the science. We see that in climate science as well. So it's extraordinary. I mean, I've often said to our graduates, the world is reflected in a raindrop. And, you take, one small farm that's struggling and you start to investigate a simple thing like why are their vegetables dying? And the next thing, a whole world opens up in terms of the relations that control not only what's affecting the water, but the relations that control the knowledge of water contamination. And then one is up against particular forces that want to demonstrate that this is the best run city, and they'll do anything to make that case, even if it means objecting to various journal editors about publications that we make. So there is tremendous power in the science. And Kelly and Mike, appreciate your comments coming from different points of view. And I think perhaps the most important thing that I can say, Mike, is that there's not one version of nature. And I think that's one of the inheritances that we have from modernist thought, that this idea of science versus nature, I mean, not science versus, no, society versus nature, as separate things, is part of a cultural inheritance that we need to grapple with. And to grapple with that means that we have to work with language that's not only limited to the words and the phrases that are considered in that particular version of science to be considered rational. And I think that's where the power of the post-colonial thinkers like Aimé Césaire comes in, to say, who arrives in France as a young 20-year-old to study, he was given a scholarship to study, arrives in Paris in the 1930s, just as the Paris colonial exhibition is starting. And there he is, a Black man, grandson of enslaved people, who's like, I've come to Paris, I've won the scholarship to study, and nothing of this knowledge that I'm being taught about the colonial world is anything that I recognize as true. What was considered to be rational and reasonable was not considered true. And he has, by the way, a very powerful essay on science and poetry, and the power of the humanities, in his case, poetry and theater, to open up relations and open up understandings beyond the limitations of the available words. So we can kind of, in a way, do more than work on in the available frames of reference and the kind of languages and statements that are predictable. And so much of the sustainability sciences are really attempting to do wonderful things. But the difficulty is that trying to translate nature into dollar values is, again, a profoundly political and cultural matter. It's not pure science. It's not pure reason or pure rationality. And those are the kinds of discussions. The issue that you raised, and I'm glad you raised it, of the difficulty of these engagements. The last thing one wants to do is cause offense, but we do have to be willing to go into issues that discomfort us. And I think I'd like to think that there's a fine and important line that we have to learn together how to address, which traverses discomfort without insulting. Because I completely agree with you, when one insults or dismisses, you lose the room, you lose the capacity to engage. And I want to challenge my colleagues in the social sciences too. We have inherited a practice of critique from May 68. But the May 68 critique can easily become the hammer and everything becomes a nail.
Yes.
And I think that we are in a planetary crisis, and finding these kinds of ways to have these generative engagements is critical. And Mike, yes, they cause discomfort, and we have to try and find a way to navigate that. But thank you for your question.
Gosh, Lesley, thank you. That's a perfect way of ending. It's what Derrida would say, there's no closure, but the questions always surface and resurface. It troubles, it unsettles, it's unfinished business, which means there's a lot more work to be done. I just
Yeah.
want to close this thread as the facilitator by saying, let me just put on my video, by saying, thank you so much for sharing with us your ideas, your thoughts, what shaped this text. I really appreciate it personally, professionally, as being somebody who's part of this process for a while now. And to close this thread, I'm going to invite my colleague who needs very little introduction, John Higgins, for some closing remarks, and to thank the people who've also inserted a few questions that we couldn't get to. But of course, rest assured that the video recording will come to you, and I'm sure the colleagues can engage you. John, over to you. My job is done here, and thank you. And I'm going to listen until the end.
Unmute. Can you hear me?
Yes, John. Yes, John, we hear you. We'll just ask Maputi to put you on video.
Okay, thank you. Well, Lesley, what a magnificent talk. I'm sure everyone who was here is very grateful to you for delivering that rich description of your book. And what a magnificent book it is. I'm sure everybody will read it. And in closing, I just wanted to say, a couple of things. One is to look back a bit to over a decade ago when a group of us worked to put together with the Academy of Science the consensus panel report on the humanities. And one of the recommendations in that report at that time was that South Africa needed to pay more attention to the scholarly book. And at that point, the book was very much in the shade. Everything was going the way of a focus on article publication, as is dominant in the natural sciences, and away from the book. And our argument then was that the book can do things which single articles alone cannot. And I think with your book, with this presentation, with the audience here, we can see one of the essential features of the book, the academic book from the humanities, is that it has a chance, it's not guaranteed by any means, of breaking out a little bit from academic closure and speaking only to our fellow specialists, but to talking to a broader public. And I think that's really important. I just want to close with, some reflections on some of the complexities of the higher education systems as we have it here, as it is all over the world. The ways in which one way of understanding it is that what it really seeks to do is to contribute to the circulation of knowledge, of making knowledge public, and also of questioning knowledge. Universities have two different functions. One is to teach given knowledge and received ideas of knowledge. The other is to put that received knowledge into question, into critique, into historicization. And of course, one of the central features of your work is exactly that kind of challenge. And it's a challenge which is absolutely crucial to the circulation of public knowledge, what's credited as knowledge, what's understood as knowledge, and how that knowledge impacts on action in the public realm. So, so thank you so much. It's kind of this is one of the first, or it is the first time at ASSAf when we followed the choice of the book with a public lecture and discussion of the book. And I think that helps to amplify successfully the mission at ASSAf that we had of showing the value of scholarly books. And thank you for inhabiting that and putting that to us. And just to close, of course, I'd just like to thank especially Lasu Reddy for leading this session, for holding it together, and so on. And of course, for the whole team of people that Lasu has already mentioned, who worked so hard on the book selection panel to find the wonderful books which are going to be presented in further sessions of this thing. And thanks also, of course, to our wonderful administrators, without whom none of this would have happened, would have been possible. Susan and Maputi especially. And thanks also to everyone who gave their time to be there with us in this strange virtual world, to have some dialogue and discussion, some questions, some probing, and your wonderful, wonderful presentation. So stimulating, so important. Yes, an exemplary work in the humanities. Thank you so much. And that's the end of my comments. Thank you. I think we can now end the session. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.